In 1853, a mining camp in the Sierra Nevada had 4,000 people, two banks, a newspaper, and a jail. 2 years later, it had 40. The gold had moved deeper into the earth, past where men with picks and pans could reach it. The camp didn't fade slowly. It collapsed. Tents came down in a week. Wooden storefronts stood empty for a month. Then someone stripped the lumber and loaded it onto wagons. By the second winter, the only thing left was a chimney and a frozen mud street that led nowhere. That's not a rare story. That's the story. Over and over, across decades, across states, across mountain ranges and river valleys and open plains, a camp becomes a town. A town becomes a city. And then, faster than it rose, it's gone. But here's what most people get wrong about this. They think boom towns died because the resources ran out. That's part of it. But towns died for a dozen reasons, and almost none of them had anything to do with the miners or the farmers or the families who had staked everything on staying. The collapse was almost always decided somewhere else by someone else before the people living there even had a chance to see it coming. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. If you want to understand why the West looked the way it did and why so many of those towns never made it, you need to understand how they were built in the first place. Before we go further, have you ever visited a ghost town or driven past a place that used to be something and is now nothing? Tell us in the comments where it was, because what happened to those places was not an accident. Because the way they were built made collapse almost inevitable. And if you've ever wondered why a town of 5,000 people could vanish in 2 years without a war, without a flood, without a fire, the answer is simpler and darker than you think. Stick with this. Because this is one of those things that looks one way on the surface and feels completely different once you understand what was actually happening. And if you find this kind of history worth watching, subscribing keeps more of it coming. Let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of any one town, but the beginning of the pattern. A man finds color in a creek bed. That's the language they used. Color, a flash of yellow in the pan. He tells someone. That someone tells 3 people. Those 3 tell 10. Within a month, 200 men are camped along that creek, and within 3 months, that number is closer to 1,000. No planning, no infrastructure, no government. Just men and the idea of gold. This is the foundation of every boomtown. Not stability, not vision, not growth. Rumor. The entire structure was built on the momentum of a rumor that turned out to be true enough, at least for a while. And because the foundation was rumor, everything that came after was reactive. Buildings went up because people needed shelter right now, not because someone had surveyed the land or thought about water supply or considered what would happen in winter. Streets formed because men walked the same paths repeatedly, and eventually the mud remembered where they'd been. A camp wasn't designed. It accumulated. This matters, because accumulated towns don't have any built-in resilience. They don't have reserves. They don't have contingency plans. They exist because people are there, and they survive only as long as people keep arriving. The moment the inflow stops, the whole structure starts to weaken. A miner walks into a general store in a Colorado camp sometime in the early 1860s. He's been working the same claim for 5 months. He used to pull $12 a day out of that ground. Now he's pulling 2. He buys flour, salt, a new pair of boots. He puts it on account. The store owner writes it down. The miner walks out and goes back to his claim. The store owner looks at his ledger. Half his accounts are behind. Not seriously behind. Not yet. But behind. That's the early warning sign. That's always the early warning sign. And nobody wants to say it out loud, because saying it out loud means admitting that the ground is thinning. And if the ground is thinning, and you own a hotel or a saloon or a printing press or a claim adjacent to the one that's thinning, you don't want that conversation to happen. You don't want men to leave before you've made your money back. You don't want the rumor of decline to spread as fast as the rumor of gold did. So people stay quiet, and the quiet costs everyone. This is the first hidden mechanism of boomtown collapse: the information lag. By the time most people knew a camp was dying, it had already been dying for months. The men who knew earliest were the ones with the most to gain from keeping it quiet. Here's the problem with surface mining. It looked like it would last forever, and it never did. The gold or silver or copper that sat close to the surface, reachable by hand tools, was always the easiest and always the first to go. A miner with a pan and a sluice box could work a rich creek and clear a year's wages in a month. Then the creek ran thinner. He moved upstream, then upstream again. Eventually, there was no more upstream. The ore didn't disappear. It just went deeper. And getting to ore that was 200 feet underground required something a lone miner couldn't provide. It required capital, machinery, shaft construction, pump systems to handle groundwater, ventilation, organized labor. This transition from individual prospecting to industrial extraction is the pivot point that killed most camps and made a very small number of men extraordinarily wealthy. A prospector who had worked a claim for 2 years had almost nothing left by the time the surface ore played out. He'd spent his earnings on food, on tools, on lodging, on whiskey, on everything that the camp needed him to spend it on to keep itself alive. He didn't have the capital to go deeper. He didn't have the equipment. He had a claim and a tired back and a debt at the general store. And here is where the outside money walked in. Men from the cities, from the financial centers in the East, from offices that smelled like leather and paper rather than dust and sweat, had been watching these camps for months. They had agents in the camps. Sometimes the men running the assay offices, the men who tested the ore and told miners what it was worth, had arrangements with Eastern investors. Not always, but often enough that it mattered. When the surface ore thinned and the miners started to look uncertain, those investors moved. They bought claims cheap from men who needed cash. They bought several claims and consolidated them. They brought in the machines. And then they hired the same miners, the men who had worked that ground independently, to work it now for wages. A miner who had been his own employer one season was a wage laborer the next, working the same mountain for a fraction of what the ground was producing. That's not accidental. That's the pattern. And it repeated across dozens of camps across the entire West. But here's what made it worse. The transition from individual mining to industrial mining didn't save towns. It bought them a few more years at most, because industrial mining required fewer men than the original rush had brought. A properly mechanized mine, with shaft elevators and ore-crushing equipment, needed a fraction of the labor force that 500 individual prospectors represented. So even when the mining continued, the population shrank, and a smaller population meant a weaker economy. Fewer customers in the stores, fewer men in the saloons, fewer children in the schoolhouse, fewer reasons for a doctor to stay. A man comes into camp one afternoon with a mule and a loaded wagon. He doesn't say much. He sets up outside the main street, prices his goods, and sells everything in 2 days. Then he leaves. He's been to 4 camps that month. He knows something the camp residents don't or won't admit. He knows which camps are spending and which ones are tightening. He can feel the difference in the weight of a transaction. And this camp, he notes as he leads his mule back down the trail, is starting to tighten. He won't be back. This is the second mechanism, the supply chain withdrawal. Merchants who served multiple settlements understood the trajectory before the residents did. When mobile traders stopped returning, and when the cost of resupply started creeping up, it was because the effort of the route was no longer worth the return. The camp was being quietly written off by the people who provisioned it. And when supplies become harder to get, prices go up. And when prices go up, the miners who are already earning less have even less purchasing power. And the local merchants, who are now paying more for goods and selling to a smaller, poorer customer base, start to fall behind on their own debts. The whole system tightens from multiple directions at once. Now let's talk about the thing that could have changed everything: the railroad. If gold and ore were the heartbeat of a boomtown, the railroad was the spine. Without rail access, everything cost more. Ore had to be hauled by mule and wagon to the nearest smelter or shipping point, sometimes over passes that were impassable in winter. Goods coming in faced the same journey in reverse. The operating costs of an isolated camp were enormous compared to a camp with rail connection. So when survey teams from railroad companies appeared in the region, every settlement watched them carefully. Every town council, every merchants' association, every mine operator wanted the line to come through their camp. And the competition for that line was ruthless. Here's how it worked. Railroad companies weren't charities. They were privately financed enterprises with investors who expected returns. They chose routes based on a combination of geographic practicality and financial incentive. And the financial incentive part is the piece that most people either don't know or prefer not to think about. Towns competed for the railroad by offering land grants, right-of-way access, sometimes direct cash payments raised through bonds or local taxation. The town that offered the most favorable terms got the line. The town that couldn't compete, or whose civic leadership made the wrong call, or whose geography put it just 12 miles off the most efficient route, did not get the line. And 12 miles was enough to kill a town. A settlement on the eastern slope of a mountain range in the mid-1870s had been growing for 3 years. It had a hotel with 30 rooms, a hardware store, a telegraph office, 2 churches, and a school with 60 students. When the railroad survey teams came through, the settlement's leading businessmen negotiated hard. They thought they had an agreement. They started printing it in the local paper. Citizens celebrated. The line went to a competing settlement closer to the valley floor. The difference in elevation made the grade too steep for the original route to be economical. Or that's what the railroad said. There were men in that valley settlement who had relationships with the railroad's principal investors that the mountain settlement's men did not have. Whether the grade was the real reason or the relationships were the real reason is a question nobody could answer cleanly at the time. What they could answer was the result. Within 18 months, ore from the mountain settlement was being hauled by wagon to the Valley Railroad, which cost more per ton than any mining operation could sustainably absorb. The cost of goods coming in rows. Several mine operators sold their operations to a consolidator with deeper pockets. Within 3 years, the hotel had 9 guests on its best night. Within 5 years, the school had closed. That's not a tragedy in the way people usually mean the word. It wasn't a catastrophe. It wasn't sudden violence or natural disaster. It was arithmetic. Slow, grinding, invisible arithmetic that played out in ledger books and railroad boardrooms, and decisions that the people in that settlement had no real power to influence. But it gets worse, because the people who stayed the longest paid the highest price, not just financially. The men and women who believed in a town and stayed when others left, who invested their savings in businesses or homes or equipment, who kept the church open and the school going and the newspaper printing because they thought the town would survive. Those were the people who ended up with the least when it finally collapsed. The early leavers got out with something. The late leavers got out with almost nothing. The ones who stayed to the end often had nothing left to move. A woman who had run a boarding house for 6 years in a mining camp on the edge of the desert had 22 guests in her best month. By the time the camp was clearly failing, she had 4. The building she'd operated in was leased, not owned. When the lease came up for renewal, the landlord, who had returned to a city 2 states away, declined to renew and sold the building's lumber to a salvage merchant. She had 3 weeks to leave. She left. That's what the end of a boomtown looked like for most people in it. Not a dramatic moment. A boarding house, a lease, 3 weeks. Now here's a question that seems obvious once you start paying attention to this pattern. If towns were collapsing this regularly and this predictably, why did people keep starting new ones? Because the early phase of a boom was genuinely profitable for some people. The first merchants to arrive in a new camp could set prices at whatever the traffic would bear, because there was no competition, and every man with a claim needed supplies. The first hotel operator had full rooms at prices that would have seemed unreasonable anywhere else. The first man to file a townsite claim, which was a legal mechanism for establishing a town's footprint and selling lots within it, could make a substantial profit before a single structure was built. These men, the early arrivers, the ones who understood the economics of a new camp, made money consistently. Not always, not on every camp, but enough that it was worth the effort of arriving first, setting up fast, and watching carefully for the signs that it was time to move on. There was a class of men in the West who did exactly this as their primary occupation. They were called townsite promoters, or sometimes land agents, and the kindest thing you could say about most of them is that they were very good at reading crowds. They would appear in a new camp within days of the initial strike, locate the most central ground, file the appropriate claims with whatever land office was nominally in authority, and begin selling lots to people who were arriving every day and needed somewhere to build. The lots were often worth considerably less than what was paid for them. The legal status of many town sites was questionable at best. Federal land laws in the West were a tangled, overlapping, frequently contradictory set of statutes that had been written in response to conditions they were already failing to address by the time the ink dried. A town site promoter with a lawyer and the patience to navigate that tangle could establish a claim that looked legitimate, sell 100 lots at inflated prices, and be gone before anyone noticed the seams in the paperwork. And if the camp died early, which many did, the promoter wasn't there to face the consequences. The man who had bought a lot and built a house on it was there. The promoter was already at the next camp. This is the third mechanism: extraction at the foundation layer. Before a single dollar of gold left the ground, money was already being extracted from the men who believed in the camp's future. A group of men crowds around a map tacked to the side of a newly constructed wooden building. The man with the pointer is well dressed for the circumstances, his coat clean, his boots recently polished despite the mud of the street. He's indicating where the main thoroughfare will run, where the civic buildings will go, where the residential blocks are planned. It sounds like a city. It looks like 20 tents and 2 saloons. The men looking at the map are miners. They've been in camp for 2 weeks. They're already tired. The ground has been good, but not spectacular. They're thinking about permanence. about sending for their families, about having something real. They buy lots. The well-dressed man collects their money, issues certificates of sale, and within a month has quietly transferred his own interest in the town site to a partner who handles collections and disputes while he moves to the next camp 2 valleys over where a new strike has just been reported. The miners hold their certificates. The ground around them keeps producing, for now. They're not wrong to hope. The problem is that hope and a town site certificate don't equal a town. A town requires things that certificates can't provide, and the men who sold those certificates knew that before they sold them. Let's talk about water. Because it almost never gets talked about, and it was one of the most decisive factors in whether a camp could survive past its first phase. Mining uses enormous quantities of water. Placer mining, the kind done with pans and sluice boxes along creek beds, requires a consistent water supply to separate gold from sediment. When a creek ran thin in dry months, mining slowed. When a creek dried completely, which happened in the desert regions of Nevada and Arizona and parts of California during summer, mining stopped entirely. A camp that couldn't mine couldn't pay its men. A camp that couldn't pay its men lost them. And men who left for better watered country didn't always come back. Some camps tried to solve this with flumes, long wooden channels built to carry water from distant sources into the mining area. Building a flume required capital and cooperation and sustained maintenance. A well-organized camp with reliable leadership could pull it off. A camp that had formed chaotically around a strike and never developed any real governance usually couldn't. Water disputes were also a reliable source of violence. Not the dramatic gunfight kind, though that happened. The slow, grinding, legal, and semi-legal kind, where upstream operations diverted water in ways that cut off downstream camps, and the downstream camps had no practical recourse because the legal framework governing water rights in the West was being written and rewritten constantly, case by case, in courts that were sometimes hundreds of miles away. A farmer in a valley below a mining district watches his irrigation ditch run dry for the 3rd consecutive week in a summer that has already been difficult. The mining operations above him are using water that once reached his land. He knows which operation is responsible. He's sent a letter. He's received a response from a lawyer in a distant city. The lawyer's letter is polite and says nothing useful. The farmer looks at his dry field. He doesn't have money for an extended legal fight. The mining operation does. He knows how this ends. He starts planning to leave. That's a pattern, you see, repeated throughout the West. The conflict between agricultural water use and mining water use was constant, and it was almost always resolved in favor of whoever had the deeper legal resources, which usually meant whoever had the deeper financial resources. But here's the problem. When farmers left a region, the agricultural base that a camp depended on for food also weakened. A camp that couldn't grow food locally or access it cheaply had to import everything, which raised prices, which made the camp less sustainable, which accelerated the cycle of decline. Everything was connected, and every connection was a potential failure point. Now let's talk about debt, because no discussion of boomtown collapse is complete without an honest account of how debt worked and who it really served. Every business in a boomtown operated on credit. The general store owner bought goods on credit from a wholesale supplier in a distant city. The mine operator bought equipment on credit from a machinery dealer. The hotel owner built or renovated on credit from a local financier. Everyone was leveraged, and the leverage made sense during the rising phase because revenue was growing fast enough to service the debt. But when the camp began to slow, The debt didn't slow with it. Interest kept accruing. Payments came due, and the men who held the debt, the wholesale suppliers, the machinery dealers, the financiers, were not in the camp. They were in the cities. They had lawyers. They had experience with exactly this situation. A storekeeper in a Nevada camp sits at his counter on a Thursday afternoon. The street outside is quieter than it was a year ago. He has 23 outstanding accounts, men who owe him for goods purchased over the past several months. Of those 23, he estimates that perhaps 12 will pay eventually. 6 have already left camp, and 5 he simply doesn't know about. Meanwhile, he owes 3 months of payments to his supplier in San Francisco. He takes out a piece of paper. He starts doing arithmetic. The numbers don't work. He already knew they didn't work, but he has to see it written down before he can accept what it means. The supplier in San Francisco has a standard contract that allows for seizure of inventory in the event of default. If the storekeeper defaults, the supplier can send an agent to take everything on the shelves, everything, which means even if the remaining miners come in to buy, the storekeeper will have nothing to sell them. He can try to sell quickly at reduced prices to raise cash for the payment, but that accelerates the camp's sense of decline, and he risks losing his customer base before he can restock. He can try to negotiate an extension with the supplier, but he's done that once already. He can leave before the default, take what cash he has, and start somewhere else. But that means abandoning everything he built here. He sits with the arithmetic for a long time. By the time a camp entered serious decline, almost every business owner faced a version of this calculation, and the outcome was rarely clean for anyone involved. Debt cascaded. The storekeeper's default meant his supplier lost money. The miners who owed the storekeeper and left without paying meant those debts would never be collected. The financier who had backed the hotel took possession of a building that he couldn't sell because nobody was coming to buy. The wealth that had circulated in the camp's peak period didn't vanish. It went somewhere. It just didn't go to the people who had done most of the work to create it. This is the fourth mechanism: capital flight. During the boom, money flowed into the camp from outside. During the collapse, money flowed out. The suppliers, the investors, the equipment dealers, the railroad companies, the speculators who had sold town site lots, all of them extracted value during the growth phase and retained legal mechanisms to extract value again during the collapse phase. The men and women who had built lives in the camp were neither suppliers nor investors. They were participants. And participation, without ownership or legal protection, is a very precarious position. And this is where things change, because once you understand capital flight, you start to see something that isn't always visible in the standard account of boomtown history. The towns didn't just fail. They were designed, not consciously, not through any single conspiracy, but structurally, in a way that made failure almost inevitable for most participants, while ensuring that a smaller number of participants could profit from the failure itself. A man arrives in a declining camp with cash money and an offer to buy. He's buying claims, equipment, buildings, anything the distressed sellers are willing to part with at a price that reflects desperation rather than value. He's polite about it. He doesn't rush anyone. He lets the arithmetic do the work for him. He waits until the calculation has been made and the decision to leave has been reached, and then he offers half of what the thing is worth, and the seller takes it because half is better than nothing, and nothing is what staying will eventually produce. This man will appear in a new camp within a year with fresh capital and a new set of opportunities. He has done this before. He will do it again. The camps were temporary for most people by necessity and by design, but for a specific class of mobile, capitalized operators, the temporary nature of the camps was itself a business model. Arrive early, extract profit, exit before collapse, return during collapse to buy cheap, sell when the next wave arrives. It worked over and over. And the people who couldn't do this, because they didn't have the capital or the information or the mobility, because they had families and businesses and obligations that rooted them in place, paid for it. Let's talk about the physical decay of a dying town, because it's one of the things that's hardest to convey from documents and one of the things that mattered most to the people experiencing it. A town at the beginning of its decline doesn't look like a dying town. That's the cruelest part. It looks like a slightly quieter version of what it was 6 months ago. The same buildings are standing. The same streets are there. There might be a few more empty storefronts, a few fewer horses tied outside the saloon on a Saturday night. But if you didn't know what to look for, you might not notice anything wrong. What changes first is the quality of maintenance. When businesses start running thin, the first thing that stops is repair. A broken shutter doesn't get fixed. A cracked boardwalk doesn't get replaced. The paint that needs refreshing stays dull. These are small things individually. Collectively, they change the feeling of a place. A town in decline starts to feel tired. It starts to feel like it knows something about itself that it isn't saying. Then the sounds change. A boom town is loud. Not the dramatic loud of gunfights and shouting, though that's part of it, but the ambient loud of industry. Hammering, sawing, the rumble of ore wagons, the sound of new construction, the constant movement of people who are going somewhere with urgency. When that ambient noise fades and isn't replaced, the silence is more noticeable than any specific sound could be. A man sits on the porch of a hotel that has 28 rooms and 6 guests. It's mid-afternoon. The street in front of him is almost empty. He can hear wind. He can hear a door somewhere swinging on a loose hinge. A year ago, at this hour, he wouldn't have been able to sit here without someone stopping to talk. Now he sits. He's trying to decide if he's going to stay through winter. He hasn't decided yet. This is the emotional texture of decline, not dramatic collapse. Waiting, uncertainty. The persistent question of whether to commit to staying or to accept that leaving is inevitable, and do it now rather than later. For some people, this question lasted months. For some, it lasted years. The uncertainty itself was a kind of suffering. Now here's a question worth sitting with. Why didn't towns rebuild after the initial resource was exhausted? Why didn't they diversify? Why didn't agriculture or manufacturing or trade replace what mining had been? The answer is complicated and uncomfortable. Some towns did survive the end of their original resource base. A small number successfully transitioned to serving as regional trade centers, or found agricultural potential in their surrounding land, or benefited from a second resource discovery that extended their life. But these were the exceptions, and they were exceptions for specific reasons. A camp that had formed around mining had formed in a place that was good for mining. That didn't mean it was good for farming. The terrain that made ore accessible, often steep, rocky, high altitude, was frequently the terrain least suited for cultivation. Water was often insufficient or unreliable. The climate at elevation could be brutal in winter and dry in summer. A location that made sense for extracting a specific resource often made no sense at all for anything else. There was also a human factor. The men who came to a mining camp were, almost by definition, men willing to move. That was the selection pressure that brought them there. When mining faltered, Their instinct was to move again, to find the next strike, rather than wait for an alternative economy to develop. The stability required to build a diversified local economy required people committed to staying, and staying was not what the structure of the camp had ever rewarded. A farmer tries to establish a market garden on the edge of a failing mining camp. He sells vegetables to the remaining miners at prices that just barely cover his labor and costs. He knows the miners are leaving. He knows his customer base is shrinking. He's trying to hold on until something changes. But nothing changes. The last mines close. The last miners leave. He's left with a garden and no customers and a plot of land that nobody wants because it isn't near anywhere anymore. He pulls up his stakes in the autumn. The garden goes untended through winter. This is the fifth mechanism. Geographic isolation. Most boom towns were in places that only made sense as boom towns. The minute the boom ended, the location itself became a liability. Distance from markets, from supply chains, from population centers, from transportation networks. All the things that hadn't mattered when the resource was rich became overwhelming the moment it thinned. The railroad decision comes back here. Because for a small number of isolated camps, a railroad connection could override the geographic disadvantage. It could make a remote location economically viable by collapsing the cost of transportation. This is why the railroad was so important, and why losing the railroad was so devastating. It wasn't just about convenience. It was about whether the camp's location was economically survivable at all, and the men who decided where the railroad went had power over the survival or death of entire communities. That power was exercised based on financial calculations and personal relationships, not based on the welfare of the communities involved. This was not unusual or surprising. It was simply true, and the communities that didn't understand it, that assumed the railroad decision would be made rationally and equitably, were consistently blindsided. A town council meets in a wooden building with a stove that's working hard against the autumn cold. There are 7 men at the table. They're discussing the latest information about the railroad survey. Someone has a letter from a contact in the territorial capital. The letter is encouraging. The letter suggests that the route through their valley is still under consideration. One man at the table has been quiet through most of the meeting. He's been watching the others. He's been doing his own arithmetic. He thinks the letter is wrong. He thinks the decision has already been made, and they don't know it yet. He doesn't say this. He's not sure enough to say it, and he doesn't want to be the man who breaks the town's confidence if he's wrong. He keeps his doubt to himself. 6 months later, when the railroad announces a different route, he's not surprised. He's also not certain his doubt would have changed anything, even if he'd said it. What could they have done? They'd already offered everything they had. Sometimes there was nothing to do. The forces deciding a camp's fate were simply beyond the camp's reach. That's not a comfortable truth. It doesn't fit the narrative of Western individualism and self-determination. But it's what the record shows. And here is the final uncomfortable question, one worth thinking about for more than a moment. Who profited from the pattern? Not from any single boomtown's success, from the pattern itself, from the fact that boomtowns were built, flourished briefly, attracted labor and spending and development, and then collapsed in ways that transferred wealth upward and outward before anyone left behind could get out with much. The mining equipment manufacturers who sold machinery to individual prospectors, and then to the consolidated industrial operations that replaced them. They sold into every phase of the cycle, the wholesale suppliers who provisioned camps and held debt instruments that gave them legal claim to inventory in default, the land agents and town site promoters who extracted money at the earliest, most excited phase when buyers hadn't yet done the arithmetic, the railroad investors who extracted right-of-way concessions, cash subsidies, and land grants from towns desperate to get the line, and then chose routes based on their own financial interests rather than the needs of the competing settlements. The consolidators who arrived during decline with cash and patience and bought assets for a fraction of their peak value. None of these men necessarily intended harm. Most of them were operating rationally within the systems available to them. But intention is not the same as outcome, and the outcome, repeated across hundreds of camps across decades, was a systematic transfer of value from the people doing the physical work to the people managing the financial architecture surrounding that work. A man rides out of a failed camp on a clear winter morning. He has his horse, his tools, a week of food, and about $30. He spent 2 years in that camp. He worked hard. He found some good color in his first month, and almost nothing after that. He had debts he's leaving behind, because there's no point in paying debts in a town with nobody left to collect them. He's not proud of that. But he's also not sure what the alternative would have been. He knows there's a new strike 2 mountain ranges over. He knows it's already got a camp. He knows men are already there. He points his horse toward the pass and starts riding. He'll arrive in a week if the weather holds. He'll look at the creek, assess the claim situation, find somewhere to sleep. He'll buy supplies on credit if he can, cash if he has to. He'll stake a claim. He's done this before. It's the only thing he knows to do. That's the part of this history that's easiest to miss when you look at it from the outside, from the position of someone who can see the whole map and trace all the patterns. From inside the experience, the rational choice was almost always to try again, not because the men involved were naive, because trying again was the only option the system gave them. There was no stable alternative. There was no safety net. There was the next strike and the work it promised and the hope that this time the ground would be richer and last longer, and that the railroad would go the right way, and that the debt would stay manageable. Most of the time, it didn't. Most of the time, the pattern repeated. The camp rose. It filled with people. It flourished briefly. Then it thinned. Then the signs appeared, the quieting streets, the empty accounts, the stopping of repair, the departure of the mobile merchants, the silence where industry had been. Then the decision to leave. Then the road out, on foot or horseback or wagon, with less than what you'd brought. And somewhere else, someone was filing a claim on a town site along a new creek where the rumor of gold had just arrived. The whole cycle started over.